Hi, I'm Judge Liz, and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, let me introduce myself. I'm a retired circuit court judge out of Broward County, Florida. Now, I may or may not look familiar to you, but if I do, it's because I presided over one of the biggest mass shooting death penalty trials in American history. At the conclusion of that trial, I retired from the bench and went into private practice. So here on this channel, we talk about all of the cases that are popular, that the people want to know about. You know, the hottest cases. We talk about P. Diddy. We talk about Blake Lively. We talk about Luigi Mangione. And my goal is to offer you a legal perspective that you won't get anywhere else. Today's video, we're going to be talking about Luigi Mangione and how double jeopardy doesn't apply to him. Coming up next. Let's start with a little background. Luigi Mangione is a 26-year-old man, University of Pennsylvania graduate, who stalked United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson for about a week over state lines, watching his movements, seeing where he goes, what time he goes there, until December 4th, when he shot him in the back 2 times, ending the man's life. Brian Thompson was a father and a husband, and he died shortly after being transported to the hospital. On December 17th, Alvin Bragg, the district attorney for Manhattan, he's widely known, been all over the news. He prosecuted, our commander-in-chief, just seems like just yesterday. But he is the prosecutor for Manhattan, and he announces that the grand jury indicted Luigi Mangione on 1 count of premeditated first-degree murder, among other things, other counts of stalking and using a firearm and things like that. But the main count, the leading count, is murder in the first degree, premeditated, which carries a maximum punishment of life in prison. And that announcement as to that state indictment by the state of New York was made on December 17th, 2024. Now, in a turn of events that I have really never seen before, 2 days later, on December 19th, the feds indict Luigi Mangione on similar charges relating to the exact same incident, with the leading charge being using a firearm to commit murder, and that carries a maximum penalty under federal law of death. So he's charged in state court and is facing a maximum penalty of life in prison, and he's charged by the feds with a maximum penalty of death, both related to the same charges. So the reason that this is interesting, for those of you, I'm assuming many of you, because you're watching this type of program or this type of video, that you also watch law and crime type shows, Chicago PD, there's a million of them out there. And in all of those fictional TV shows, you probably remember a time or an episode when the state police, the local police do this whole investigation and they're very vested in the case. And then the feds swoop in and they just take over, and the local police are so mad and they don't want to give it up. And the feds are like, oh, we're the feds, we're taking it. Well, that's fiction. That's made for TV. That's not what happens in real life. And I know from my personal experience. So what actually happens, many of you know, some of you don't, I was a prosecutor for 11 years in violent crimes here in Broward County, Florida. So the state government and federal government have separate criminal laws. And there are a lot of state charges, criminal charges that the federal government does not have. However, in a case where the feds have a federal statute to go under and they have a federal charge for the actions of what could also be charged as a state crime, what happens is the state gets together with the federal prosecutor and they say, okay, let's see who has the highest penalty. So let's say in a case of, firearm by felon, the state's maximum penalty may be 15 years in prison, where the feds, for whatever reason, their penalties for possessions of firearm are much higher. They're 30 years in prison. So they say, okay, all things considered, the feds have a higher punishment at stake. The feds take the case. Sometimes the state has a higher punishment. So in Florida, you can actually get 40 years in prison for breaking into somebody's house. And of course, in federal court, they wouldn't have a law similar to that. So in that type of a case, the state would keep the case. What's going on here that is so interesting, and it is something that I have never seen before, is you have a state prosecutor, Alvin Bragg, who's filed the charges, and then you have the district attorney for the federal government, the federal prosecutor, who has filed the charges just 2 days later. 2 days in between, they're both charging the same crime of the same individual. Now, common sense would dictate that the feds would take the case because the feds have the possibility of the death penalty, where in the state of New York, they don't have the death penalty. So if it's a maximum punishment of life versus a maximum punishment of death, in my experience, death would win, the feds would take the case. But not Alvin Bragg. Alvin Bragg not only is not conceding or letting the feds take over, but he has actually assigned 6 seasoned prosecutors from his trial divisions, his major crime divisions, 6. He's also assigned 9 other civilian employees, including trial prep assistants and analysts, to work on the case. So he's got 15 people from his office working on this case, what I would assume would be full-time. Now, how much is that going to cost him? I would have thought that common sense would dictate, because the federal government has the higher penalty in this case, that Alvin Bragg would gladly turn the case over to the feds and say, take the reins. But he didn't. He assigned 15 employees to try the same case with the possibility of life in prison. So here's how this is going to play out. And by the way, I've talked to many of my colleagues who are federal judges, and they can't think of a single instance when this has happened, where the state prosecutes somebody, and even if they get a conviction and they get life in prison, the feds are still going to take it because the feds are going for death. If the state gets a not guilty, in their case, the feds are still going to take it, and the feds are still going to go for death. I mean, what are we doing here? It seems like this is a little bit of a political circus. I'm going to tell you an experience that I had. It was back in when I first started as a prosecutor. I was, it might have been like 2008-ish, give or take. And there was a deputy, Todd Fata, who was killed while serving a warrant. And he was a member of the Broward County Sheriff's Office. It was a tragic, terrible, terrible day. And while he was serving the warrant and he was killed, he was also serving he was cross-certified as a BSO deputy, Broward Sheriff's Office deputy, and a federal agent. So because the feds had their task force involved, that gave the federal court jurisdiction over this case. Now, the office that I was working for was fully prepared to prosecute this case, fully prepared to seek the death penalty. But in this situation, the feds came forward, told the state attorney for Broward County, we have jurisdiction. They were on a federal task force. We're going to take the case. Now, was my boss happy about it? Probably not, because most people don't realize this, but state prosecutors who try murders all the time have a lot more courtroom experience than federal prosecutors, who very rarely go to trial, because in the federal system, everything's stacked against the defendant, and that's a whole nother video. But he gave it over because it would be a complete waste of the resources of the taxpayers to have the state try the case and then have the feds try the case. A complete and total waste of money. Mr. Bragg has assigned 15 people from his office to prepare this case for trial. 15 people that could be working on other cases while the feds take it. But he has insisted that he's going to keep these charges, that his people are going to try the case, and then, best case scenario for them, Luigi Mangione is found guilty, he gets life in prison, otherwise he gets acquitted. He's going to go straight over the feds, and they're going to do the exact same thing. Right? One on top of the other. I mean, does that make sense? How wasteful. But I haven't even gotten to the big question. The big question is, what about double jeopardy? Speaking of double jeopardy, the general rule is a person cannot be tried for the same crime twice. In other words, if the crime consists of the same behavior and the same incident and the same facts, and the person is acquitted, the person cannot then be tried again. So the state can't go and try to accumulate more evidence after a not guilty verdict only to try the defendant again. They're barred by double jeopardy. But under the state and federal constitution, the law is that the state and the feds are different sovereigns. Therefore, jeopardy doesn't attach, even if it constitutes the same criminal act. Now, in speaking to the judges that I know, the federal judges, we were not able to think of a single instance where somebody was acquitted in state court and then tried by the feds. We were also not able to think of a single instance where somebody was convicted by the state court, but then tried by the feds. But you can see where we are here. I mean, I don't talk politics on this channel, not too often, but this is a pissing contest between the state and the feds. And the feds are saying, give it up, Mr. Bragg, because we have a higher penalty. Let us take the reins. And he's saying, no, I don't care if you have the higher penalty. So what does Mr. Bragg get out of this? Because if you think about it in two ways. One, he's acquitted. He spent all this money, and then the feds are going to take the case. Two, he's convicted, and he gets life in prison, and then he's convicted in federal court and gets the death penalty. In any scenario that you can come up with, Bragg is losing manpower from his office, time, and money. Does this make sense to anyone? Okay, so I need a sidebar for a second. I thought of a case, or I found a case that my colleagues and I had overlooked because it didn't happen on our part of the country and it was so long ago. But there was one case, and it was an instance in 1991 where Rodney King was badly beaten by the Los Angeles Police Department, and several officers were charged in that beating, which was caught on video. The case went to trial against the officers, and they were acquitted in California State Court. Shortly thereafter, the feds indicted them under federal law, and they were found guilty in federal court. That is an example of how double jeopardy does not attach, how there's two different sovereigns. So just because the officers were acquitted in state court, they could still be convicted in federal court. I had to add that because I know one of you will remember it and you'll bring it up. So I wanted to bring it up before you could. All right, we're getting ready to wrap up here, and I'd like to know what you think. Should Luigi Mangione be tried in federal court first, or do you agree that the state court should try him first? And what do you think about this whole double jeopardy thing? Should double jeopardy apply to state and federal courts? In other words, should they be treated as the same sovereign instead of separate? Should somebody be able to be tried in a state court, acquitted, and then retried for the same act in federal court? If you're new here, I hope you'll subscribe to my channel. I hope you'll check back weekly for new video content. And other than that, let me know what you think in the comments. I try to respond to all of the comments that are left, and I'd love to hear your insight. Signing off. Thanks for joining us.